How are you? I hope you're okay. My name is Eunice Gathoni, your facilitator for this unit. I just wish you had time to attend virtual classes, because I think virtual classes or attending virtual classes rather than reading or listening to the recordings would be better, because we'll have a one-on-one interaction with the people. But since you are e-learning student, I'll just be recording, but the classes I'll be holding them from 11 a.m. to around maybe 2 p.m. or 1 p.m. depending on the topic on Wednesday. Wednesdays from 11 a.m. to around 1 a.m. or 2 p.m. depending on the topic we are handling. So please, if you're able to access this portal, or if you're able to access this virtual class, please be attending from Wednesday at around 11 a.m. to around 1 p.m. And this I've changed the class because on Monday, the time that it was scheduled on the timetable, I have other classes, and unfortunately the class is a common class, so it's a bit hard to change the time of that class. So I changed the time of this class because it's a class that belongs to the DCPY class course only. So we will start with the introduction to psychology of communication, and then another thing, after we are through with the first two topics, we'll have our cards, and then I'll also post your assignment. We've already done cards for the other units, so we will have to rush for this card for this unit, because we are behind, like 1 month behind others, because the semester started 1 month ago. So please be going through the notes on your own, be going through the recording as well as the PowerPoint presentation that I'll be posting in each and every topic. Today, we'll start with the introduction to psychology of communication. And to start with, we'll start with the definition of a term, of some terms. And the first term that you're going to define is communication. So it's taking time to load. And as you know, communication is exchanging message from the sender to the receiver and vice versa. So the receiver might change now to be the sender when they are responding to whatever they were sent to by the sender or by the first sender. So communication involved the transfer of messages from one person to the other, that is from the sender to the receiver. We must have the sender, we must have the message, and we must have the receiver. So communication is the process of passing information from one person to the other, and there is understanding. There must be understanding for communication to be there. Otherwise, if I talk to you in a different language that you're not familiar with, I'll not be communicating. I'll just be throwing words, but you're not understanding. So still understanding must be present. It is impossible to communicate. Thus, when there is no understanding, it is not possible to communicate. When there is no any understanding. So humans communicate by use of language in form of sounds and gestures. So there are two types of languages that a human can use, either sounds, they can use verbal language, or non-verbal language, that is use of gestures. So for example, babies yell at different frequencies depending on whether they are hungry, frustrated, or full nappy, or have a full nappy. So usually their cry can tell the difference. So the baby is communicating, but the baby is not using words, they're using only sounds. So still communication can occur through making of sounds. We have various types of communication that you normally use in various areas or during various circumstances. So people communicate with one another in a number of ways that depend upon the message and its context in which has been sent. So depending on the message that you want to pass across, for example, if you want to condemn someone and if you want to soothe someone, the context there is different. Or the message there that you'll pass is different. So types of communication will change based on both context and the message. So the first category that we can categorize communication is the first one. The type of the first one is on types of communication based on the communication channel used. The communication channels used. So human communication is marked by intention and anticipation of the reactions. So communication in human can be verbal when mediated by language, or non-verbal when no language is involved. So when we want to use language, we will call that a verbal language. When we will want to use gestures, that is non-verbal language. So we can differentiate, or we can have two types of communication depending on the channel used. So the first one is verbal communication, where message is transmitted verbally through either the word of the mouth or through writing. You can either write or you can either use the mouth. So the objective of every communication is to have people understand what we are trying to convey. In verbal communication, it must be very short, or it must be short and simple. Otherwise, when you use a lot of words to mean one thing, you might mislead people. So in order to deliver the right message, you must put yourself on the other person's side and think what your receiver point, or what is your receiver's point of view, or from your receiver's point of view. Since people will have their own or different attitudes, perceptions, and emotions and thoughts about a different topic, or about a topic. For example, if you want to talk about female genital mutilation to a group of people who believe in female genital mutilation, first I have to put myself in those people's shoes, or from the point of their view, and then talk. Otherwise, if I condemn female genital mutilation and I want to discourage people from practicing female genital mutilation, if I condemn it in my own way, or if I express my feelings or my perception of my attitude towards female genital mutilation to them, they will deny, or they will not even accept whatever you're telling, because you'll use a judgmental language. But if you talk from their point of view, you'll use a language that they will be able to accept. So it's good that you first put yourself on their shoes, or think from the receiver's point of view before you talk, because it will create a challenge if there be a challenge if you're not talking from the point of view. So you have to ask yourself questions like, would the recipient understand the message? How will the sound on the other side of the table, how will be my sound on the other side of the table, or how will the receiver receive my message? Then verbal communication can be divided into oral, as I've already said, or written communication. So oral communication is spoken word, or spoken words are used. It includes face-to-face. It can be either face-to-face conversation. It can be either speech. It can be telephone communication. It can also be through video, like the one now you're listening to. It can be radio. It can be television. It can be voice over the internet, like the one that I'm using, etc. So in oral communication, communication is influenced by pitch. Is the pitch very high? Depending on the context, or depending on the message, or whatever that you want to convey to the other person, you will use different pitches. You'll use different speed and clarity of speaking. So it will be used by pitch. It will be used by speed. If you're too fast when you're communicating, you might end up losing some people, because different people, some are slow learners, some are fast learners. So you'll have to determine whatever your audience is, and then maybe determine the speed at which you're going to speak. Then clarity of speaking. Are you clear? Are you able to pronounce your words well? Because some words, when you miss pronunciation, you might even mean something else. So oral communication will be influenced by those three: by pitch, by volume, the speed and clarity of speaking. Then another advantages of this oral communication is it brings quick feedback. You're able to get the feedback quickly, unlike in written. For example, if I write a letter to someone, if I write a memo to the entire department, if I write a message to another person, they might take time before they internalize whatever that I've written and then pass the response to me. So it quickly brings the feedback. Then in a face-to-face conversation, you'll be able to understand the facial expression and body language, and this will enable you to know whether the person have really understood or how did this person receive my message. For example, if you're giving a speech and you find some people sleeping, it means that maybe you're not communicating, or you're too boring. You will be able to get the feedback quickly through facial expression. If you talk to a person and that person frowns or becomes sad, you'll be able to read that and maybe change whatever that you're telling them. So it brings that quick feedback, and you're able to read facial and body language, and one can guess whether he or she should trust what is being said or not. Then the disadvantage of this oral communication is that user is unable to deeply think. For example, if I'm reading a paragraph, I can read as many times as possible, but so the disadvantage is that you're not in face-to-face discussion. You're not given enough time or even ample time for you to deeply think about whatever that you have been told and give feedback. But as for the written communication, you can reread and even deeply think about what the message entails, and then that's when you can be able to deliver your feedback. That's the disadvantage of oral communication. The next type of communication in this category, or verbal communication, is written communication, where written signs or symbols are used to communicate. A written message may be printed or handwritten. Message can be transmitted via either email, by a letter, by a memo, etc. Message in written communication is influenced by the vocabulary you use. If you use very ambiguous words or very deeply meaning words, you will not be able to pass your message well. So you must work on your grammar, you must work on your writing style, you must also work on your precision, you must also work on your clarity. Is your language clear? Can the person reading your message clearly understand whatever that you want to portray? So you have to, those are the inferences of written communication on the message that you want to portray. So this, since majority of written communication is normally used in official setup, these messages are normally passed through memos, they're normally passed through reports, they're normally passed through bulletins in offices, job description, employee manuals, electronic mails. These are the type of communication that are normally used in internal communication. So I said written communication is normally usually used, especially nowadays, in official setup. So in official setup, we can have either internal or external communication. In internal communication, you will use memo, we use reports, we use bulletins, we use the job description, we use all these examples to pass information internally through written communication. For external environment, or when you are communicating to the external environment, for example, you want to pass a message to the entire community, we normally use websites, we normally use letters, you rarely find letters circulating in the internal environment. You normally rarely find, they're not usually used. You rarely find maybe a letter being sent to a junior worker. It's either a mail, it's either a memo, so they normally communicate internally using those. But for the external, you'll find website, you'll find letters, you'll find brochures, you'll find contracts, telegrams, faxes, postcards, news from the media, brochures, and others. So written communication can be either internal communication or external communication, or written information or written communication can be passed to internal environment or external environment. What are the advantages of written communication? Written communication, messages can be edited and revised. For example, if you want to write a letter to someone, you will edit and edit until you find the best letter or the best message to send. But for the verbal, whatever you say, you can't re-edit because already the message have been passed across. So that's the first advantage. Then the second advantage is that written communication provides records for every message sent. So you can put that letter, you can put that memo in a file and use that file after 5 years. But as for verbal, the ones the message have been portrayed is the receiver to capture, and maybe they might forget even after a week. So a written message enables the receiver to fully understand it and send an appropriate feedback. The third advantage is that the receiver will fully understand through reading and reading whatever that you have sent them until they understand before they give you feedback. So those are the three advantages. You're able to edit, they can be stored for future record, and that lastly is that the receiver can fully understand and then give feedback to you. Then what are the disadvantages of oral communication? Unlike in oral on written communication, unlike oral communication, written communication do not bring instant feedback. If you are sent a letter, or if you send a letter to someone, to an office, you'll have to wait until they give you back your feedback through another letter. So it takes time before you get the feedback. But as for the face-to-face or phone call, you're able to get an instant feedback. Let's take an example. When you're calling up someone and when you're texting someone. When you're texting someone, you'll have to wait until they text back. But when you're talking to someone one-on-one, you'll be able to get the feedback timely or insert feedback. So it takes more time to compose a written message as compared to word of mouth, and a number of people struggle for writing ability. So when it comes to writing communication, it's not only it's only easier, or it's only applicable to people who are able to write and write well. And it is easier for people who are able to, who are literate enough to be able to write and read. And also it takes time for you to compose the message. Unlike when you're talking, you just need to think and talk. But as for this one, you need time to write and compose whatever that you want to pass across. So that's the verbal communication. And I've said for verbal communication, we have either oral communication, or we have written communication. Then the second category of communication in this category, or the second type of communication in this category, is nonverbal communication. Now we are using gestures, we are using body language, we are using posture, we are using tone, we are using voice or facial, or tone of voice or facial expression. For example, when a baby is crying, that's the tone of voice. You can't say that is oral communication because they're not talking any words. For oral communication to occur, there must be spoken word, or for verbal communication, there must be words used. But if the words are not used, for example, you're screaming, that is tone of voice. Facial expression, these are wordless. There is no use of words here. You're using gestures. You're using body language, you're using posture, you're using tone of voice and facial expression. So nonverbal communication helps receiver in interpreting the message received. For example, when you're talking, we normally apply both the two. You use facial expression as well as verbal communication, or you use nonverbal communication together with the verbal communication. So this normally, the gestures will normally help you to interpret well the message being passed across verbally. After nonverbal signs reflect, often nonverbal signs reflect the situation more accurately than verbal message. For example, you will be able to know whether a person is stating the truth or not by looking at nonverbal language that they are using. However, sometimes nonverbal response contradicts verbal communication and hence affect the effectiveness of the message. That's why I've used that example. For example, if a person is lying, you'll be able to know that person is lying, because if the verbal is contradicting the non-verbal, definitely whatever the message is being portrayed may be misunderstood. Then we have another category of communication, types of communication based on purpose. So then the next type or category of communication is communication types of communication based on the purpose and the style. And we have two types of communication under this category. We have formal communication and informal communication. For the formal communication, I want to use this example. It's like you student speaking to the registrar. The type of communication or the mode of communication that will speak to the registrar as compared to your fellow students is totally different, because when you're speaking to the registrar, you're speaking formally. When you're speaking to your friends, you're speaking informally. So informal communication, certain rules, convention, and principles are followed when communicating the message. You have to follow some certain courteous way to communicate. For example, the way you greet the person is totally different to the way you greet your friends. So formal communication occurs in formal and official style. Usually professional settings, corporate meetings, conferences undergo informal patterns. So the professional settings, corporate meetings, conferences, you'll feel the communication is formally. Then type of language used there, the way the language is communicated is a formal way, in a formal way. So informal communication, use of slang and foul language is avoided totally. You don't use sheng, you don't use bad language when you're communicating to your authority, because you're using formal communication. So the second of category or types of this category is informal communication channels. It's just you're allowed to use sheng, you're allowed to use because of the context you're to your friends. You speak to your family members. You use formal language. You use affiliations in terms of communication, use of slang language, but of course not at all. Example, when you're talking to your father, you talk friends. So unlike formal communication, use some authority lines. So in an organization, it helps in finding out staff grievances. When you want to know about what the staff are going through, you use the informal communication, because once you use communication, they will not be able to do. But when you use informal, they are them. So informal communication creates relationship between affiliation. Then the third category of communication, a type of communication based on effective communication and the content. The first category is informative communication, where language does not directly code facts about the world. Instead, the speaker and listeners rely on shared assumptions to allow them to communicate more efficiently. So in informative communication, people will understand more when you're not using a direct language. When you use an indirect language, for example, if I say, and when I say is harmful to your health, when I'm using those two, one formative, another one is formative. For informative, you use indirect language to communicate a direct message. Under this category, involving emotion. When you're involved emotionally, you normally use affective communication. So affective communication is communicating with someone either with or about affect. A crying child will communicate to the parent, and the parent will confront the child. So the two are engaged in affective communication. An angry customer complaining to the customer service representative, and that representative trying to clear up the problem. They are involved in a affective communication. The communication is dealing with expressions, dealing with emotions. So affect. So the next type of category, or the next type of information or communication, is indispensable. So the next category is indispensable communication, and this communication normally involves motivation. So the first one, the previous one involved emotion, but as for this one, it involves motivation. So indispensable communication involves motivation, and when people are motivated, or when you use motivational language or motivational communication, these they will be able to achieve something in life. If you're motivated to do something, you will be able to do, or you want to achieve that something in life. So how can people be motivated? It is again through communication only. A person might achieve many things in life if she or he knows the art of science of communication. So in this context, it is said that culture has a great impact on communication. In fact, culture is communication, and communication is in culture, because you will find different culture using different types of languages. There's some culture which will encourage women to work hard and to be better in life. Some others will discourage them. Others will discourage the men. So it depends with the culture that a person belongs to, that they will be able to apply this type of communication. So in this category, we have formal communication. In this category, we have informative communication, which normally uses indirect language to cause a change of action, or to maybe to instill an action in people, or to make people do something. So you're using an indirect language here. The next one, you're using emotions, and the third one, you're using motivation. So the next type of communication or category of communication is type of communication based on the number of participants. Based on the number of participants. So when it comes to intrapersonal communication, is when you're communicating with self, you're communicating with yourself. Sometimes you communicate loudly when you're speaking, when you're thinking loudly. Sometimes this communication is subconscious. You're not even aware that you're thinking. For example, when you're driving, you will be able to drive well since you are subconsciously driving. You're not thinking of the driving fully, but part of your mind is in other businesses. Maybe you're thinking of your work, you're thinking of your family, you're thinking of many things, and the same time you're driving. So sometimes intrapersonal communication is subconscious, and this is the way we normally think, or we normally interact with ourselves. So it refers to the interaction that occur in your mind when you're talking with yourself. While we may occasionally think out loud, we usually do not verbalize our internal dialogue. Although sometimes you normally think loud, sometimes you're under stress, you have many things that are disturbing your peace. So you find yourself thinking now, you're talking to yourself. So that is intrapersonal. But majority of intrapersonal communication normally occurs you're not verbalizing it. You just it normally happens in your mind. When you sit in class and think about what you'll do will do later that day, you're communicating intrapersonally. So similarly, when you send yourself a reminder note as an email or text message, you are communicating intrapersonally. When you set your alarm, you're still communicating intrapersonally. So a lot of intrapersonal communication occurs subconsciously. So when we drive into the driveway without thinking, in quotes, we are communicating intrapersonally on a subconscious level. I think I've already explained that. The second type of communication is when we have two or more people present, and this is interpersonal communication, which is characterized by informal interaction between two people who have identifiable relationship with each other. Talking to a friend between class, visiting on the phone with your mother, and texting or chatting online with your brother, etc. So it helps us understand how and why people behave and communicate in different ways to construct and negotiate a social reality. So interpersonal communication occurs between people who understand each other, who have a relationship with each other. So when people are communicating, for example, with their friends, with their family members, that is interpersonal communication. The way people, for example, the way I'll talk to my mother will help you know how my relationship with my mother is. The way I'll talk to my neighbor will help you know, just the way I'll talk to them, will help you know that either I have a bad relationship with them or I have a good relationship with them. So we have, in this category, we have intra and interpersonal communication. Then the next category is on types of communication based on the extent to which the interaction is characterized by formal or informal exchanges. And the first category, or the first type of communication under this category is small group communication, where we have 3 to 20 people who come together to communicate with one another. So there are many kinds of small groups. Examples, it would include maybe a family gathering, a group meeting, a friend group meeting, a Bible study meeting, a group of classwork on a project, a management team in the workplace. So a small group of people communicating can occur in face-to-face settings as well as online. You can have a Zoom meeting with your friends, with your classmates. You can have a Zoom meeting with your workmates if you're working. You can have a Zoom meeting in many ways, or in small groups. For example, the chamas, the merry-go-round chamas, that is small group communication because you're not involving a lot of people. Then in the next type of communication is when you're discussing with many people above 20. For example, when the president is communicating to the entire nation, that is public communication. When, for example, you have Madaraka Day, the president is addressing the nation, some will hear through online, some will hear through television, some will hear through radios, some will hear even directly if they're inside wherever stadium he is. So all this communication is passed through, all these messages are passed through public communication, which includes public speeches and other types of mass communication that you may experience live, in person, or delayed or mediated basis. So go back to the last slide. So it can also be copied or the media the information later, and also mediated when you have the media coming in between you and the president. Already occurred and information, but nowadays internet have been used or have been applied, really been used when you are communicating or when people are communicating, because nowadays we have posting job adverts in the internet where every person is able to some people even post their CVs. Advertising, buying products, and other political activism normally involve public communication. So those are the categories of communication that you normally have. This communication depends on the type of context that exists. So we have these types of categories. Let me call them categories because each and every category have its own types. So communication depending on the media use, communication depending on the number of people you're speaking to, communication depending on the context that you want to use, communication depending on the channels where we have either verbal or non-verbal, and in this verbal we have oral and written. Then we have communication types depending on the purpose and the style of the communication, where we have the formal and informal. And then we have communication, types of communication based on the effectiveness and the content. So effectiveness and content. So for the first one, indirect messages are more effective as compared to direct message. For the second one, it depends on the content, because if you want to involve emotions in your communication, that is effective communication. For the indispensable communication, if you want to instill some motivation to people, if you want to motivate some people, you need to use indispensable communication. Then we have another category of communication where there is type of communication based on the number of participants, where we have either you yourself, you're talking to yourself, or you're talking to people or another person who you are related to. Then the last category of communication is the types of communication depending on the extent to which the interaction is characterized by either formal or informal. What number of people do you want to pass your information to? Is it a small group number of people, or is it a public communication, or is it a public message that you want to portray? For example, if you want to pass a message on drug abuse, pass a message on rape and crime cases, that is, you can use public communication because you want to benefit a lot of people. Then we have core concept of communication. These are some things, some core things that must be there for communication to occur. There must be some intent, where there is, this is where both the source and the receiver know what communication is occurring. know that the communication is occurring. This exclude all the accident by overhearing or instances where the television is on but the room is empty. So there must be intent. For example, if I want to pass a message to another person, I must make sure that that person is aware that I want to communicate to them. Otherwise, if you're just talking and you don't know whether your audience will listen or not, you might not pass your message. Then another thing is that a communication must have some meaning. Without a shared understanding of the meaning of words or symbol, communication is at best limited. Your message must have a meaning. You just don't pass meaningless message to other people. Then you should not communicate where there is interferences of noise, because the communication might not be understood, because the receiver may focus on the noise and not focus on you. So there will be a lot of interferences when there is noise. We have two types of interferences. We have semantic interference, where the meaning is unclear, and psychological interference, where the receiver is unable to understand the message because they are of their own state of mind or personality. So this we also have another type of technical another interference known as technical interference, where there is static on the line, like static on the line. So when we have when you're talking through phone and there is another maybe electronic gadget around, there's some sounds that normally occur where you feel some weird sounds that normally distort the message. So that's a technical interference. So we have technical interference, we have semantic interference, and we have psychological interference that might occur when you have a lot of noise around when you're communicating. Then we have feedback. When you're communicating, there must be some feedback. Take an example when you're talking to someone and maybe that someone they're not changing they're not using either verbal or non-verbal language to communicate back. They're not changing their face, they're not changing their body position, they're just there. So that will not enhance the communication. For communication to be enhanced, the sender and the receiver must communicate. It's a two-way thing. The sender will pass the message and the receiver will give you the feedback. So it is important that feedback exists in communication. Then we have mediation, and which is the means by which the communication is transmitted. Which means are you using? Are you using body language? Are you using verbal or non-verbal communication? So there must be the two. The two must go hand in hand. When you're communicating, you must use gestures, you must use spoken language, you have to combine them for the communication to be effective. Another one is unmediated, which means a two-way contact that does not pass through a channel or media. Then the last one is that this can be one-to-one speech or even many-to-many protests. It's worth pointing out that even direct communication between individuals contains a number of variables such as voice, body language, proximity, and facial expression. So when there is, for example, you're giving a speech, you're giving a or you're involved in a protest, you have to use both the verbal and non-verbal language for you to be able to pass your information. So I think that will be the end of today's lecture. So I hope this finds you well and you're able to understand. Even if in case you have any question or any clarification that you want me to make, you can use the channels that I gave you. You can use my phone number or my email address to ask for any clarification or any question that you might have. So have a lovely time and God bless you all.